those two great men, two great leaders, in fact, were linked in the quantum hologram. Because, in fact, there are many more coincidences that haven't even been published. People always talk about the obvious ones, like the fact that Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln, and Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy.
That's right.
And that President, for example, there are many more. The fact that President Lincoln, when he was coming to Washington to be sworn in as president in 1861, was saved from assassination earlier by a New York policeman named John Kennedy. So there are many. I even myself, in my own research into the paranormal, found a Kennedy-Lincoln synchronicity that's never been identified before, which is that the diary that John Wilkes Booth had in his pocket when he was shot by Boston Corbett, when he was supposed to be apprehended so he could be tried for President Lincoln's assassination, he was shot to death in a farmhouse in Virginia. That diary was passed on to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. And when it was later released to the government at large, 18 pages were ripped out and were missing. Well, if you go forward to the life of John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy was involved in the Bay of Pigs, which was the CIA's failed invasion of Cuba. And then he was assassinated several years later. Well, on the Watergate tapes, Richard Nixon, also viewed as a negative figure in history, like Stanton sometimes is portrayed, deleted 18 minutes of the Watergate tapes. And those 18 minutes were about what he was calling the Bay of Pigs thing, which was Kennedy's assassination. He was using the shorthand Bay of Pigs, the Bay of Pigs thing, to as a form of shorthand to tell his staff when he was talking about the assassination of President Kennedy by the CIA, partly as a retaliation for the Bay of Pigs fiasco. So here you have essentially both the Lincoln's assassin and a later president talking about Kennedy's assassination with 18 units of missing data. I mean, so when I began to dig into the Lincoln Kennedy coincidences and see, read how many there are, I began to realize that there are others. But I don't think that's a result of quantum access. I know that they were sending us back to view former presidents. For example, they were sending me to the Lincoln assassination site to see who shot him and to see whether every time they sent me there, the same person would be involved in his assassination or whether he would indeed be assassinated on that night's visit to Ford's Theater. So we know that by focusing on the Lincoln assassination, Project Pegasus was able to prove the existence of the multiverse. That is, that the past and the future are multidimensional, at least within a limited context of several different timelines that can be selected. But I don't think these very profound quantum synchronicities regarding Lincoln and Kennedy resulted from the quantum access capability of the U.S. government.
Is that the same thing?
Rather, I believe that they simply are the fact that Kennedy and Lincoln are embedded in the quantum hologram as the spiritually advanced people they were, who sought the U.S. presidency as a way of having a benevolent effect on human history. If that makes any sense.
It does. Is that the same synchronicities with David Wilcock and Edgar Casey?
Well, I mean, David alleges that he was Casey. There's certainly a physical resemblance, and I can see David's career as being the fulfillment of, or the continuation of the activities of somebody like Edgar Casey. I think that would be more explainable based on reincarnation.
They just
For example,
parallel each other so much.
I know who I was in my last life, but I don't reveal it just because I don't want to be thought of it as the reincarnation of that person. But I'm carrying on my work from my past life in a similar way. So I think the doctrine of reincarnation explains that. But now, I don't have evidence proving that we haven't contacted past administrations based on time travel. We have, for example, the anecdote about that alleged angel who confronted Thomas Jefferson, I believe in the White House Rose Garden or in some garden like it in the U.S. Capitol, shortly before being sworn in as American president.
Could that be a time traveler?
Huh?
Could that be a time traveler, the angel?
It could have been a time traveler, because one of the things we did is we went back and we confronted Washington's troops and urged them to retreat in that famous, completely bloodless retreat from New York Harbor. that Washington's revolutionary regiments perform in the middle of the night. We were sent there to actually tell those men we were angels, and we persuaded them to retreat because they were going to be annihilated by the British. So we know that quantum access has been used to create the preconditions for benevolent or beneficent past events. And that was actually a kind of a violation of the code that the project had decided, which is that quantum access in general would not be used to alter the past or future. But that was used to implement an event that we knew from the timeline had happened. But no, I don't think the Kennedy-Lincoln coincidences can be ascribed to quantum access, but I do think they show that there are patterns of coherence within the quantum hologram. That Abraham Lincoln and John Fitzgerald Kennedy had similar destinies in the quantum hologram, and that because they were so focused around really courageous leadership in terms of fostering civil rights and elevating the political discussion to pursue such high ideals, that the mundane facts of their life sort of corresponded in a highly synchronous way.
Awesome. We talked about that before, and I really wanted to get that question in again. Okay, so I want to go back to Mars, and when you were speaking about human-animal hybrids, and I was thinking that reminds me a lot of Atlantis, what they were doing in Atlantis, human-animal hybrids. What is your take on that? What do you think about Mars's connection with Atlantis?
Well, you've actually asked a very brilliant question that goes to some of the key data points in our whole understanding about humanity's ancient interaction with Mars. Plato called, in all likelihood, the great maritime civilization that was destroyed by the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC, Atlantis. And you've also added the critical data point that there's historical references to creatures in the nature of creatures that were, let's say, half man and half horse in Atlantis. That, in other words, the Atlanteans may have been involved in genetic engineering.
Or Greek mythology.
And also the hybridized animals that appear in Greek mythology. So yes, I mean, how that could have come about is that the great maritime civilization that was scientifically advanced enough to create a colony on Mars placed some of its hybrid creatures up there, which would be a natural place for them to do so because it was another biosphere that they could release hybridized animals on and not have the consequences if they did so on our planet. So again, that also supports the notion that I think Mars was a colony of the of the Earth civilization. But I think the connection here is that Atlantis was the great maritime civilization that preceded that catastrophe 11,500 years ago, that had built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, whose center was at Cairo, which means Mars. And we find the similar landscape architecture of the Cydonia site on Mars at Avebury, England, at the Giza Plateau near Cairo, and in Washington, D.C., where you literally have the Masonic influence of the connection to the ancient Egyptian civilization as decanted historically through the Anglo-American civilization, which placed Cydonia-like sites at Avebury, England, and at Washington, D.C. So, it's all connected. I think the explanation for that would be that the prior civilization on Earth was already involved in genetic engineering and placed some of its creations up on Mars.
To continue the testing ground area, or almost just like a Frankenstein kind of, where you release all your projects all on the surface.
Right. They could have. Those creatures could have been sequestered up there. They could have been quarantined to Mars. They could have been released and not killed off there as they would have been on Earth. We have the whole human warfare with dragons on Earth, and you wonder if those were, for example, species of flying or sulfur-based reptiles that were simply pestilential to human settlements and needed to be basically annihilated. So on a planet like Mars, such previous creations of genetic